Rain hammered the streets of Seoul like the sky itself was grieving. Red and blue lights bounced off wet pavement. Police radios crackled. Neighbors stood in doorways, wrapped in blankets, whispering the same question. Where is she? Kang Jiho stood in the middle of the road, soaked to the bone, his voice breaking apart as he screamed one word over and over. Nari, his daughter, 8 years old, missing for 6 hours. The billionaire who never begged anyone for anything was now on his knees in the rain, begging the universe to give his little girl back. Then, a call came through on an officer's radio. She'd been found. Not at the mansion. Not at school. Not anywhere they'd searched. She was 3 miles away, curled up asleep on a stranger's doorstep, in front of a small, crumbling apartment building. When Jiho reached her, he dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms, sobbing into her wet hair. Nari's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in 3 years she spoke. Just one sentence. I just wanted to go back to Kosi. Jiho froze, because 3 weeks ago, he had forced that very woman out of his home, out of his daughter's life, and out of his own heart. Welcome to Afro Meets Soul Stories. On today's episode, you get a dose of unexpected encounters and beautiful beginnings. If this is your first time here, make sure to like, subscribe, click the notification icon so you never miss another amazing story, and send the story to friends and family who would love it too. Also tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I genuinely love reading where everyone is watching from. Now, let's go back to where this unforgettable story truly began. 6 weeks earlier, Kosi Okafor had learned a long time ago that grief doesn't announce itself. It simply moves in and rearranges the furniture of your life. She was 28, and in the last 5 years she had buried both her parents, raised her 2 younger siblings on her own, and crossed an ocean chasing a promise she'd made herself. We will not stay broken forever. Seoul was cold in a way Lagos never was. Not just the weather, the silence. The way strangers avoided eye contact on the subway. The way the city moved fast and expected you to keep up or disappear. But Kosi didn't come to disappear. She came to build something. Her cousin Adiz had gotten her the interview, a position with Seoul Premium Residential Care, an elite agency that staffed Seoul's wealthiest households. The pay was good, the hours were long, and there was one assignment nobody wanted. They call it the widower's house, the placement coordinator told her, barely looking up from her clipboard. Kang Jiho. You've heard the name? Kosi shook her head. You will. Youngest self-made billionaire in the country. Tech and shipping. Cold as ice, though. We've sent 9 staff members in the last 4 months. None of them lasted more than a week. What happened to them? The coordinator's pen paused. His wife died 3 years ago. Car accident. The daughter was in the back seat. Since then, she exhaled. The house doesn't feel lived in. It feels like a museum nobody visits. Are you sure you want this one? Kosi thought of her siblings back home, of the tuition due next month, of the quiet promise she carried in her chest like a lit candle. I'm sure. The mansion sat behind iron gates in Seoul's most exclusive district, all glass and pale stone, the kind of house that looked like it had been built to be photographed, not lived in. Kosi arrived at 7 in the morning, her uniform pressed, her small suitcase of supplies rolling behind her. A housekeeper named Mrs. Yoon met her at the door, gave her a tour that felt more like a warning, and pointed toward a closed study door at the end of a long hallway. Don't go in there unless he calls for you, Mrs. Yoon whispered. And don't try to talk to Nari. She won't answer. She hasn't spoken in 3 years. Kosi nodded, though something in her chest tightened at that last part. She was polishing a marble console table in the East Wing when she first saw the girl. Small, thin, dark eyes far too heavy for an 8-year-old's face. Nari stood at the top of the staircase in a pale blue dress, watching Kosi the way one might watch a stranger wander into a place they weren't supposed to be. Kosi didn't call out. She didn't wave or smile too wide the way adults sometimes did around grieving children, as if cheerfulness could be forced through a closed door. She simply looked up, met the girl's eyes, and offered a small, warm smile, the kind that asked for nothing in return. Nari didn't smile back, But she didn't look away either. For 3 full seconds, something passed between them. Then the girl turned and vanished down the hallway. Kosi went back to her polishing, her heart strangely full. She didn't hear the study door open behind her. She didn't hear the footsteps. "You're the new one." The voice was low, controlled, and utterly without warmth. Kosi turned and found herself looking into a pair of gray eyes so sharp they seemed to see straight through her. Kang Jiho stood in the doorway of his study, tall and still, dressed like a man who hadn't taken a real breath of air in years. "Yes, sir," Kosi said, straightening. "Kosi Okafor. I was told. I don't care what you were told." His gaze flicked, briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the staircase where his daughter had just been standing. Something unreadable moved across his face. "Just don't make promises to my daughter that you can't keep." The last 5 didn't understand that. He turned back toward his study. "Mr. Kang," Kosi said quietly before she could stop herself. He paused. "I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. To anyone." For a moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her, really looked, as if no one had spoken to him that plainly in a very long time. Then, without a word, he disappeared back into his study and shut the door. Kosi stood alone in the hallway, unsure why her hands were trembling. She didn't know yet that this house, cold, silent, and grieving, was about to become the place where her whole life changed. And upstairs, hidden behind a half-closed door, a little girl who hadn't smiled in 3 years was already thinking about the woman with the warm eyes, wondering for the first time in a long while if maybe, just maybe, someone new could stay. The first week passed the way Kosi imagined a funeral procession might feel, quiet, careful, everyone tiptoeing around a grief too heavy to name. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly. Mr. Kang left before sunrise and returned long after Nari had gone to bed. Mrs. Yoon ran the household with clipped efficiency and clipped emotions to match. And Nari moved through the mansion like a ghost haunting her own life, present, but never quite there. Kosi noticed things the others didn't bother to. She noticed that Nari always paused by the piano in the sitting room, but never touched it. She noticed the girl's plate came back from every meal almost untouched, the vegetables pushed into careful, untouched piles. She noticed that Nari slept with her bedroom door open exactly 4 inches, no more, no less, as if she were still waiting for someone to check on her. Nobody had told Kosi any of this. She simply paid attention. On the 9th day, Kosi was dusting the piano when she found a small, folded paper airplane tucked behind the bench. She unfolded it carefully. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, was a single crayon drawing, 3 stick figures standing beneath the sun. A man, a little girl, and a woman with long hair, smiling. Kosi's chest tightened. She refolded the airplane exactly as she'd found it and placed it gently back where it belonged. That evening, she left a small bowl of sliced mango on the piano bench, not offered directly, not pushed, just there. A quiet invitation. The next morning, the bowl was empty. By the 2nd week, small things began shifting. Nari started appearing in rooms Kosi was cleaning, not speaking, just sitting nearby, watching her work. Kosi never forced conversation. She simply narrated her task softly, the way one might hum a tune. "This vase is older than both of us combined, I think," she said one afternoon, wiping down a porcelain piece by the window. "See this little chip here? Somebody loved this vase enough to keep it, even broken." Nari's eyes lingered on the chip. Another day, Kosi hummed an old Afrobeat melody while folding laundry, and for the briefest second, she caught Nari's foot tapping, just once, before the girl caught herself and went still again. Kosi said nothing. She simply smiled to herself and kept folding. She began leaving small things behind. A pressed flower on the windowsill. A doodle of a smiling sun taped inside a drawer Nari always opened. Tiny, wordless gifts that asked for nothing in return. Jiho noticed before he meant to. He noticed his daughter's door was open wider than 4 inches now. He noticed a half-eaten bowl of fruit that hadn't been thrown away in disgust. He noticed, one evening coming home early, the faint sound of humming drifting from the sitting room, and found Kosi at the piano bench, not playing, just sitting beside Nari, who was pressing single, careful notes with one finger. He stood in the doorway for a long moment unseen. It was the first time in 3 years he'd heard music in that house that didn't feel like an echo of what was lost. That night, Jiho found himself lingering in the kitchen long after Kosi had finished her shift, watching her write something in a small notebook at the counter. "You keep records," he said, startling her. Kosi looked up, quickly closing the notebook. "Just notes. What she likes, what she avoids, what days feel harder than others." She hesitated. "I hope that's all right." Jiho was quiet for a moment. "The others just cleaned." "I cleaned too," Kosi said simply. "But a house isn't just floors and furniture, Mr. Kang. Sometimes it's the people inside it that need the most care." Something flickered behind his gray eyes, not quite warmth, but the ghost of it. A man remembering what warmth used to feel like. "She hasn't spoken in 3 years," he said quietly. "Doctors. Specialists. Nothing has worked." "I'm not trying to fix her," Kosi said. "I'm just trying to let her know she's not alone in there." Jiho studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand a language he'd forgotten how to read. "Good night, Miss Okafor," he finally said and walked away. But he paused at the hallway corner and turned back, just once, to watch her gathering her things, humming softly to herself. 3 days later, everything changed. Kosi was tucking Nari into bed when she noticed the girl reaching, hesitantly, for her hand. Kosi went still, barely breathing, and let their fingers link together. Nari held on tight. Then, in the dim lamplight, the little girl's lips parted. No sound came out. Not yet. But her mouth was moving, shaping something. A word. A real word, forming for the first time in 3 years. Kosi leaned closer, her heart hammering, tears already gathering in her eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" she whispered. "You can tell me." Nari's grip tightened around her fingers. And just as her lips finally began to form a sound, the bedroom door swung open. Jiho stood frozen in the doorway, having heard everything from the hallway, his eyes wide with a hope he hadn't let himself feel in 3 years. "Nari," he breathed. The moment shattered. Nari's eyes snapped toward her father, and just like that, she pulled her hand back, turned away, and closed her eyes tight, pretending to sleep. The silence returned. But something had shifted in that room. Something none of them could take back. She was so close to speaking, and Jiho walked in at the worst possible moment. What do you think Nari was about to say? Drop your guess in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. For 2 days after that almost moment, the mansion held its breath. Nari retreated further than before, as if frightened by how close she'd come to breaking a promise she'd made to herself long ago. Kosi didn't push. She simply kept showing up, steady, warm, unwavering, the way sunlight returns every morning whether or not anyone asks it to. On the 3rd evening, Kosi was reading aloud in the sitting room, an old folktale about a girl who planted a garden from a single seed of hope. Nari sat curled at the far end of the couch, knees pulled to her chest, listening the way a starving person listens to the sound of cooking in another room. Kosi reached the final line of the story. And even in the driest season, the girl remembered that some things take longer to grow. But they always do. She closed the book gently. The room was silent. Then so softly Kosi almost missed it. "Mommy used to read that one." Kosi's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment like glass. Nari's eyes were wide, glassy with tears, her small hands trembling in her lap. She had spoken. Actual words. A full sentence, after 3 years of silence. Kosi didn't cry. Not yet. She simply opened her arms, slow and unhurried, leaving the choice entirely to the little girl. Nari crossed the space between them and collapsed into her, sobbing, not from sadness alone, but from the sheer exhausting relief of finally letting something out. Kosi held her and wept quietly into her hair, whispering, "You did so well, baby. You did so well." Neither of them heard Jiho arrive in the doorway. He stood frozen, one hand braced against the frame, watching his daughter speak for the first time in 3 years, into the arms of a woman he'd only known for a matter of weeks. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. That night, after Nari finally fell asleep, a real sleep, peaceful, her door left open a full foot, Jiho found Kosi in the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner dishes. "Thank you," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. Kosi turned off the tap. "She did it herself, Mr. Kang. I only gave her a place safe enough to try." 3 years, he said, shaking his head. 3 years of specialists flying in from Tokyo, London, New York. Nothing worked. And then you. He trailed off, searching for words that didn't exist yet. "You didn't try to fix her. You just stayed." "Sometimes that's the only thing broken people actually need," Kosi said softly. "Someone who stays." Jiho looked at her then. Really looked, the way he hadn't allowed himself to look at anyone in 3 years. Not at her uniform. Not at her role in his household. At her. The steadiness in her eyes. The quiet strength beneath her gentleness. The way she made his house, for the first time since his wife died, feel less like a museum and more like a home. "I don't know how to thank you for this," he said quietly. "You don't have to," Kosi said, drying her hands. "Just keep showing up for her the way you did tonight. That's thanks enough." He didn't move. Neither did she. The space between them felt smaller than it had a moment ago, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Then his phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the silence. He glanced at the screen, and his entire posture changed, shoulders tightening, jaw setting hard. "What is it?" Kosi asked. "My in-laws," he said quietly. "My late wife's parents. They're arriving tomorrow." Something cold moved through the kitchen that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The Choi family arrived the next afternoon in a convoy of black cars, exactly the way people arrive when they want a house to feel smaller the moment they enter it. Choi Eun-suk, Nari's grandmother, swept through the foyer in a cream Chanel suit, her eyes sharp and assessing. Her husband, Choi Dae-hyun, trailed behind her, silent but no less imposing, a man who'd built half of Seoul's shipping empire and expected the world to answer when he called. "Where is my granddaughter?" Eun-suk demanded, not bothering with the greeting. "Upstairs. Resting," Jiho said. "Resting." Eun-suk's eyes swept the hallway and landed, sharp as a blade, on Kosi, who was carrying a tray of tea toward the sitting room. "And who is this?" "Kosi Okafor. She's part of the household staff," Jiho said. Eun-suk's gaze traveled slowly over Kosi, her uniform, her skin, her presence in a house that had belonged, in her mind, to her daughter alone. "I see," Eun-suk said, in a tone that suggested she saw a great deal more than she was saying. "Jiho, we need to talk. Privately." She turned and walked into the study without waiting for a response, the way people do when they've never once in their lives been told no. Jiho glanced back at Kosi, a brief, apologetic look, before following his in-laws into the room and closing the door. Kosi stood alone in the hallway, the tray trembling faintly in her hands. She didn't need to hear the conversation happening behind that door to know, deep in her chest, that something was about to go terribly wrong. "Quick question for you. Do you think Nari's grandparents are acting out of love or out of control? I'd genuinely love to hear your take in the comments. And if this story has you hooked already, hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next." Voices rose behind the study door, low at first, then sharper, like a storm gathering strength before it broke. Kosi couldn't make out every word, but she didn't need to. She heard money. She heard reputation. She heard her own name spoken the way one might describe an intruder. 20 minutes later, the door opened. Eun-suk emerged first, her expression unreadable, followed by her husband. Jiho came last, his face pale, his jaw tight in a way Kosi had never seen before, not cold, but cornered. "Kosi," he said. His voice was careful, formal, a stranger's voice. "Could I speak with you?" "Privately." Something in Kosi's stomach dropped. They stepped into the empty dining room. Jiho closed the door behind them, and for a long moment, he simply stood there, unable to meet her eyes. "Say it," Kosi said quietly. "Whatever it is." Just say it. They believe. He started, then stopped, exhaled hard, and tried again. They believe your closeness with Nari isn't appropriate, that a member of staff shouldn't be this involved in a child's emotional life. They're threatening to challenge my custody arrangement if I don't. If you don't let me go, Kosi finished for him. Jiho said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Do you believe that?
Kosi asked.
Do you believe I've done something wrong here? No, he said immediately, almost desperately. God, no. Kosi, what you've done for her. Then why does it matter what they think? Jiho ran a hand through his hair, and for the first time since she'd met him, the billionaire who owned half of Seoul's skyline looked utterly powerless. Because if they take this to court, they could use it to argue I'm unfit to raise her, that I let a stranger raise my daughter while I disappeared into work. They could take her from me, Kosi. I can't risk that. Not even for... He stopped himself. Not even for what? Kosi asked softly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The answer was written all over his face, in the same helpless, aching way it had been written there for weeks. Kosi felt her chest tighten, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, slow and steady, gathering the last of her dignity around her like a coat. I understand, she said quietly. I won't make this harder for you than it already is. Kosi, let me say goodbye to her, she said.
Please.
She deserves that much. Nari was sitting on her bed when Kosi came in, sensing immediately, the way children always do, that something was wrong. Are you leaving? She whispered. Kosi sat beside her, taking both small hands in hers. I have to go, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean what we found together disappears.
Why?
Nari's voice cracked. Did I do something wrong?
No, baby.
Never. You did everything right. Kosi pressed a kiss to the top of her head, fighting back tears of her own. You found your voice again. That's yours now. Nobody can take that from you. Not me leaving. Not anyone. I don't want you to go. I know. Kosi's voice broke on the words. I don't want to go either. But I need you to promise me something. Keep talking. Keep singing. Keep being brave, even on the hard days. Can you do that for me? Nari nodded, tears streaming silently down her face, and threw her arms around Kosi's neck, holding on like she was trying to memorize the feeling. Neither of them noticed Jiho standing frozen in the hallway, watching through the half-open door, his own eyes wet, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, furious at a world that made him choose between the family he'd lost and the family he was terrified to lose again. Kosi left the mansion an hour later with a single suitcase and a heart cracked clean down the middle. She didn't look back at the house. She couldn't. She knew if she did, she might not have the strength to keep walking. The weeks that followed were quiet in the worst way. Kosi threw herself back into work, took extra shifts, sent more money home, tried to fill the silence with anything but the memory of a small hand gripping hers in the dark. At the mansion, the silence returned like an old, familiar ghost, except this time, it was worse. Because now everyone remembered what the house had sounded like when it was alive. Nari stopped speaking again. She refused breakfast, refused school, sat by the piano for hours without touching a single key. Jiho watched his daughter disappear back into herself, and every single day, he felt the same two words clawing at his chest, your fault. He'd built an empire out of never losing. And now he'd lost the one thing that had made his house feel like a home, twice. 3 weeks later, on a night when rain fell over Seoul like the sky itself couldn't hold back anymore, Mrs. Yoon knocked frantically on the study door. Mr. Kang, she said, breathless. Nari isn't in her room. We've checked everywhere. She's gone. Jiho's blood turned to ice. Within minutes, the household was in chaos. Security combed the grounds. Drivers were dispatched. Calls were made to the police, to security firms, to anyone who might help find an 8-year-old girl who had vanished into a rainstorm, alone, in a city of 10 million people. Jiho stood in the foyer, soaked from checking the gardens himself, his phone shaking in his hand as he dialed emergency services. He didn't know it yet, but 3 miles away, a small figure in a yellow raincoat was walking determinedly through the rain, following a route she'd memorized from staring out car windows for weeks. She wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was going. I want to know, did you see that coming or did it catch you off guard? Drop a comment below, and if your heart is racing right now, that's your sign to subscribe, so you're here for the finale. What happens next is going to break you a little before it heals you completely. The rain hadn't let up in hours. Jiho stood in the middle of the street, exactly where we found him at the very beginning of the story, soaked, breaking apart, screaming his daughter's name into a city that refused to answer him. Police cars lined the block. Neighbors watched from doorways. Somewhere behind him, Eun-suk clutched her husband's arm, her composure finally cracking after weeks of certainty that she'd done the right thing. Then the call came through. She'd been found. Not lost. Not hurt. Just walking. A patrol officer had spotted a small girl in a yellow raincoat, curled up asleep on the front step of a modest apartment building 3 miles away, as if she'd walked there with absolute purpose and simply run out of strength once she'd arrived. Jiho didn't remember the drive. He only remembered falling to his knees on the wet pavement in front of that building, gathering his daughter into his arms, sobbing into her soaked hair like a man who'd been given back something he thought he'd lost forever. Nari stirred against him, her eyes fluttering open. And then she spoke, the sentence that had been echoing since the very first frame of the story. I just wanted to go back to Kosi. Jiho pulled back and looked at the building behind her.
Kosi's building.
His daughter hadn't wandered aimlessly through Seoul in a rainstorm. She had navigated 3 miles of city streets alone, in the dark, because in her heart, this, not the mansion, not the museum of grief he'd been raising her in, this was home. Above them, a window opened. Kosi leaned out, hair falling loose, eyes wide with disbelief at the sight below her building. Nari, she breathed. She was down the stairs in seconds, barefoot, running into the rain without a coat, and gathered the little girl into her arms as if no time had passed at all. Nari clung to her, sobbing, whispering her name over and over like a prayer she'd been holding in for 3 long weeks. Jiho watched them, soaked, kneeling on the pavement, and understood, with a clarity that hit him like a physical blow, exactly what he'd almost let his fear cost him. The next morning, Jiho stood in his in-laws' living room, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't lower his voice for anyone. I let you make me believe that protecting Nari meant keeping her isolated, he said. That love had to look like control. But Nari didn't run to a mansion full of things last night. She ran to a woman who taught her how to speak again. That's not manipulation. That's not a threat to my custody. His voice cracked, then steadied. That's the only real family she's had since her mother died. Eun-suk opened her mouth to argue, out of decades-old habit. But something in her son-in-law's face, steady, unshaken, finally present, stopped her. We were afraid of losing her too, she admitted quietly, finally, after a long silence. We thought if we controlled everything around her, we couldn't lose anything else. I know, Jiho said, softer now. I understand that fear better than anyone. But Nari doesn't need us to protect her from love, Eun-suk. She needs us to let her have it. For the first time, the grandmother had nothing left to say. 3 weeks later, the mansion looked nothing like the museum it had once been. Flowers filled every room, hydrangeas and peonies spilling from vases in the foyer, the sitting room, even the once untouched piano bench. Music drifted through the halls almost constantly now, sometimes Nari's careful, improving piano, sometimes Kosi's soft humming as she moved through a house that had finally, truly become a home. Kosi was in the garden one evening, watching Nari chase fireflies barefoot across the grass, when Jiho found her. I have something to ask you, he said, and for a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, his hands were visibly shaking. Kosi turned, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He knelt in the grass, not the polished, controlled billionaire the world knew, but simply a father, a man who had learned, painfully, what it meant to almost lose everything twice. You didn't just clean my house, Kosi, he said. You gave my daughter her voice back. You gave me back a version of myself I thought died with my wife. I don't want a museum anymore. I want a home. And I can't imagine building one without you in it. He opened a small box. Nari, catching sight of them from across the garden, came running, fireflies forgotten, and threw her arms around both of them before Kosi had even managed to answer. Say yes, Nari whispered, the same small voice that had been silent for 3 years, now sure, clear, and full of life. Please say yes. Kosi looked down at the little girl who had taught her that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, patient moments, one held hand at a time. Then she looked at the man who had finally learned to choose love over fear. Yes, she whispered, tears streaking down her face. Yes. Epilogue. A year later, the mansion that once felt like a museum now echoes with laughter every single day. Nari plays the piano every evening, badly and joyfully. Kosi's siblings visit from Lagos every summer, filling the halls with a warmth the house had been starving for since the day it was built. And Jiho, the man who once believed love was something you lost and never got back, finally understands that sometimes the family you were meant for doesn't arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it arrives with a mop, a warm smile, and a patience that outlasts every storm. What part of this story hit you the hardest? The moment Nari spoke for the first time, or the moment she was found on Kosi's doorstep? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable Afro meets Soul story. And as always, tell me which city and country you're watching from. Thank you for being here until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.